Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J. As another year comes to a close, I thought it would be interesting to break away from my review niche for a meta discussion. And considering how much time I spend with Japanese media, what better topic to mull over than one of the thorniest in entertainment, localization. Now, you may be wondering why I've bundled adaptation into this video's title as well, and the simple answer is that, in many ways, they're the same process, taking something that exists in one form and attempting to expand the audience by translating it, either to a different language or different form of media. Though the exact challenges of translating a book to a film are going to differ from translating to a different language, a lot of the same conversations arise. It's a curious topic to discuss because, depending on who you're talking to, it's either the most or least important aspect. At its core, this seems to be a result of how one chooses to critique a work. If the goal is to be as objective as possible, then when it breaks from the original is little more than the debate equivalent of insult to injury. You will hear very few complaints about the film adaptations of The Shining or How to Train Your Dragon despite how much both diverge from their respective sources, because they hold up on their own merits. However, there is a reason that the Netflix adaptation meme exists, because especially for anime to live action, the end result often doesn't work well as a standalone product or adaptation. As a result, for an objective analysis to care about adaptation, you must first demonstrate that there is a legitimate problem, or at the very least, a better way to handle something in your story. However, once you've demonstrated the problem, that is as far as an objective analysis cares to go, and bringing up that the original avoided said problem is little more than twisting the knife. You had the working blueprint in front of you, you deviated without understanding it enough to make it better, and now look at this fine mess we've gotten ourselves into. That said, even if we may wish to be as objective as possible, whether something holds up under the microscope and whether we like it aren't always correlated. You could present me the most immaculate first-person shooter ever created, but if the only way I could play it is with a controller instead of my keyboard and mouse, you'd be forgiven for thinking the game somehow gained sentience and murdered my family. In a similar vein, a lot of discussions around localization and adaptation can be tangential to the actual quality of the work, as the original audience isn't necessarily looking for the best product, but instead the best representation possible of something they love in that form. Take the Mario movie for example. When you break down the plot of the film, it's pretty standard fare for a kid's movie. Bowser wants to take over the world, basic themes about family bonds are established and lightly touched upon throughout, Mario and Luigi get roped into the action in a way that makes enough sense to not be jarring, shenanigans ensue. For the legacy film critic, who isn't clued into the absolute cavalcade of callbacks and cameos ranging from well-liked characters making an appearance to something as simple as how Mario jumps, they'll be more likely to sit there going, well, it's a lot of pretty lights, but they don't give much reason for why they have to create their carts before getting onto this random rainbow road. And the small bonding moment between Mario and Donkey Kong really should have been given more time to breathe before they were suddenly friends. And to be fair, that second one is my biggest issue with the film. As well it could be worse, it could also be better by fleshing out scenes like that. There was one moment where Mario and Donkey Kong both realize they have trouble pleasing their fathers, they sit there for a moment, and then we get no more insight into what that means to either of them before they're back to finding a way out of their predicament. However, the reason why the movie was successful is because the general audience going to see it were going there explicitly for Mario. They know Mario as a franchise is light on the story, so they weren't expecting anything complex or thematically potent, but instead a fun romp through the Mushroom Kingdom, which it was. If it had been complex and thematically potent while still being a fun romp through the Mushroom Kingdom, then no one would have complained, but since that's not what Mario is known for, they kept it simple. There was enough story to be cohesive and to get the set pieces they were looking for, to where adults taking their kids to it can follow along well enough, and then for everyone who's a fan of the franchise, regardless of age, they can be satisfied with seeing the characters doing the thing. Of course, while you can have this effect, where those who love a franchise adore the adaptation while an outsider might look on in confusion, you can also run into the opposite. A curious example of this is with Spider-Man Homecoming, as it ended up being that exact circumstance, among people who otherwise found themselves in agreement on a lot. For this example, I'll be focusing on a couple of critics whose YouTube channels were kickstarted off the back of the negative reaction to The Last Jedi. Among that lot, you tend to see two kinds of critics, ones who are more focused on the writing and internal consistency of a work, such as Mahler, or those who are more focused on cultural aspects, such as Nerdrotic. The two I mentioned specifically are on very good terms, as there's enough of an understanding of each other to be cordial, to where they were able to politely disagree on Spider-Man Homecoming. For Mahler, he and the co-hosts on his podcast really liked the film on account of the writing. If you were going to introduce Spider-Man this late into the MCU, the way they did so gave him a natural hook into the wider world, with a story that's a direct and coherent consequence of the events of the original Avengers film, and with Peter being given quite a lot to juggle between the mask and his civilian life, on top of Iron Man's expectations versus Peter's ambitions. However, Nerdrotic wasn't a fan of it, because he's a super fan of the original comic books. By my understanding, Spider-Man is a character whose major theme is that of perseverance no matter how hard it gets, no matter how lonely the path remains, and no matter what kind of sacrifices are required. This ends up being a major draw for a lot of people, and why he's one of the most popular superheroes of all time, as no matter how much he struggles to balance the costume and civilian life, no matter how tough the opponent, no matter how isolated and overwhelmed he seems, he always gets back up and perseveres, which can be really inspiring. With the MCU version though, there's the perception that having Iron Man give him the suit cheapens that, as he's given an AI companion that can talk him through stuff, a guardian angel to bail him out of trouble when he gets over his head. And because of that, there's a perception that he didn't fully work for his victories until his final battle with the Vulture. It may be a fine story, but as a Spider-Man adaptation, there's a core to the character that's perceived as missing, which some die-hard comic book fans lament. This is one of many reasons for why discussions around adaptation can become so contentious, as the two were working with completely different standards and reached completely different conclusions based on that. As a result, when they met on an episode of Mahler's podcast to hash out their differences, being joined by Mahler's co-host named Rags and another Culture War personality named Jeff from World Class Bullshitters, the results were tragically as you would expect, with them primarily talking across from each other about their particular standards rather than coming to a definitive conclusion. Though my personal inclination is to focus on how well written something is, I don't want to dismiss the concerns that Nerdrotic and Jeff have out of hand. After all, if a work is being adapted but shares little resemblance to the original, that could speak to the intent behind its creation. To start with, if an adaptation is such a name only, bearing little resemblance to the original work, then why use the name at all? Is it due to a lack of confidence in the story you're telling, a lack of confidence in the original work, or a cynical attempt to just cash in on the name? I'm certain one could come up with all manner of reasons for why it's okay to take the name, but for the original audience, if your new story is good and can hold up on its own merits, then why not name it something else and leave the original name to a more faithful recreation? Even if an adaptation follows the same general story beats, for something to be adapted or localized as we're about to discuss, there's at least some understanding that the work has something about it that's appealing and attracted an audience. Because of that, there's less business risk than on trying to create a new story from scratch, which can lead to a lot of cynicism creeping into the production. We don't have to worry about the built-in audience because they'll show up no matter what we do, so we can make the story we want without much care for what came before. I don't believe this happened to Spider-Man Homecoming due to how well written it is, but when it does occur, it tends to be a self-correcting problem. It may take months, it may take years, but eventually bad word of mouth will sour the discussion surrounding something made out of cynicism rather than something made out of passion for the material. It's a shame that something terrible gets produced, but eventually the lesson is learned, and the works that have proper passion and dedication behind them, who do a good job at bringing out the best in a world or story, will rise to the top. Furthermore, if you're a fan of something, then you, more likely than not, like it for something unique that it does which you want people to know about. Back when I played League of Legends, I was one of very few who took an interest in the backstories and lore of the playable characters and the world they inhabit. As broad a spectrum as the characters have in order to be distinguishable in-game, the world they inhabit is a surprisingly deep well of possible stories that only in the last few years has been coming more to the forefront. And what better example of this could possibly exist than Arcane? I've mentioned it in passing elsewhere, but it's set a golden standard for what an adaptation should be, and is hands down the best video game adaptation of all time. It would have been easy to say, well, we've got all of these characters across this massive world, so let's just do an anthology of the characters doing their thing and call it a day. And for the dedicated audience, that probably would have been enough. Instead, they created a very character-driven story centered in one specific part of the world, set the appropriate tone for the show right off the bat, and while someone with more knowledge of the lore could tell you where they diverged, a lot of the core remained, and was excellently told. No, I didn't make this video just to tell you all to watch Arcane, but even if you know nothing about the source, it is well worth watching. Hell, it might actually be better that way, since only one of the playable characters gets obvious plot armor, so it may be more suspenseful to not know who's more likely to make it out alive. With that in mind, we've spent a fair amount of time on adaptation, but haven't touched on localization much. In keeping with what I just mentioned, with a fan wanting something well adapted for the sake of honoring what makes it special, at least part of the historic success Japanese media is seeing in the Western market is because of how different it is from Western media. As Hollywood continues to flood the market with remakes and the comic book industry continues to make itself as niche as possible, foreign media has effectively replaced both for a lot of people. There's a fair amount different in terms of the stories told as a result of the cultural and language differences, but that's exactly what people like from it. To see this unique place in people, to see what they can come up with, and to enjoy an entertaining story all the while. Which naturally means once something gets in between the fan and his enjoyment of that thing, there's often a lot of brouhaha about it. And if you want an example of that playing out in its full horror, you need look no further than Fire Emblem. A lot of hay has been made about this franchise, with most of it flaring up when the localization for Fire Emblem Fates was closely examined and found by most standards to be incredibly wanting. Since then, it's been a cyclical routine where every time a new game is out, the localization is examined and a lot of discussion is made about what was changed, why it may have been changed, and whether or not the changes are acceptable. Before we get into specifics, let's lay some groundwork first. Localization as a term has been the mainstream word used to define the process of translating something to a different language. The reason why they don't just use the word translate is because a direct translation is oftentimes next to impossible. For a lot of anime especially, where mouth movements are simple enough that an English dub can attempt some degree of lip syncing, getting a one-to-one of the meaning, including implications, wordplay, and cultural references can be extremely difficult. It is an absolutely unenviable job, to where the charitable reading of the word is to say, well, you can't be exact, but try to get as close as you can, while the uncharitable reading is to say, oh, so you just wanted a euphemism to hide behind so you could get away with culturally appropriating it. Of course, whether or not you choose to be charitable will be based on how well the media you consume has been handled and how steeped in the culture war you are. So to give a sense of the conversation itself, let's get back to Fire Emblem. While Fates is the example often given, I'm going to choose instead to focus on an example I'm far more familiar with. Fire Emblem Three Houses. Before I get too far, this is a game that I quite like, to where I can and have talked about it for literal hours, and there are moments of brilliance from the localization staff. The best example is for a character called Petra, who due to growing up in a foreign land relative to the game's story, has trouble speaking with others. The first unavoidable instance of this shows up in the group introduction where she intends to compliment the protagonist, but accidentally implies that the protagonist is overweight. The means by which the Japanese and English scripts accomplish this wordplay is fairly different, but the substance remains intact, which is what you'd hope for. Unfortunately, I brought up this game because while there weren't as many reported localization problems as there were in Fates, those that exist run the gamut of what's possible. So let's give a few examples. To start us off, we have one that masks over cultural differences. In it, Ingrid, a character who greatly values chivalry and knighthood, is lambasting her friend Sylvain for being an unrepentant skirt chaser. Their first one-on-one conversation has her publicly shaming him for crimes ranging from trying to involve himself with another noble's daughter, to making a move on Ingrid's grandmother, to quote, making eyes at a scarecrow. Yeah, welcome to Japan, I guess. However, that last one was an invention by the localization team, as the original line was that he was making advances to a man dressed as a woman. For whatever reason, a fair amount of humor in Japanese media involves playing with gender expression, with this not even being the only instance of the trend in Three Houses.
I remember those times well, particularly your first words to me. Look at that young maiden wielding a giant lance. How adorable.
Oh, don't look at me like that. I was thrown off by your haircut, that's all.
It's all water under the bridge. Now, back then I was quite furious about it.
So if lines like that are allowed in, why was this one changed? Well, part of it was likely because of a vocal minority of activists in the English-speaking parts of the internet. Back when the internet was less mainstream, the word trap was used to describe someone who intentionally and convincingly presents themselves as the opposite gender but still identifies by their biological sex. However, as transgender conversations became more common, a subset of activists began taking offense to the term. I would caution against taking such offense, as while there might be concern of a stigma arising that transgender individuals are faking their condition, from a tactical standpoint, you're only going to encourage that stigma by getting angry at the word rather than calmly maintaining a clear distinction. To put it another way, methinks the they-them doth protest too much. All that to say, I've never seen direct confirmation of this, but I suspect that the reason for the change in 3 houses is to explicitly avoid generating buzz like this, as making a trap joke in my review to emphasize the point got the expected response. And regardless of my thoughts on the subject itself, this is one case where I don't agree with the change. While it may convey a similar idea, the differences are enough to lead to an unintended understanding. A common fan theory is that Sylvain has bad eyesight, as he has one of the worst dexterity stats of the playable characters, and in another conversation complains about how small the words are on a friend's magic textbook. Saying that this incident was a scarecrow adds to that theory more than if it were a cross-dresser, as in that case, it could just be him misreading the situation. In fact, the spin-off added another one of those misreadings to Sylvain's sordid past.
Perhaps I might even agree to go out with you sometime. So long as you don't use any more of your awful pickup lines from the first time we met. Oh, how did that one go again? Ah, yes. Hello there, my adorable little chickadee. Care to let this rooster into the hen house?
Look, I already apologized for mistaking you for a girl, so you can quit bringing it up now.
And give up such an embarrassing tidbit on the next Margrave Gautier? Never!
Because of that, I'm hesitant to believe the idea given that, despite complaining about the small print, he can still read it, and comprehend it well enough to confound his friend. Also, we know glasses exist in this world, and if a merchant's son like Ignatz can get them, so can a noble heir, especially one who will need to contend with unfriendly neighbors to the north. I know I'm the last person to say stop overthinking this after making these 2 videos, but stop overthinking this. As another kind of localization issue, we have some lingering trouble from Nintendo having a family-friendly image stateside, which sometimes compels them to tone down sexual innuendo, even as they leave this in a more niche franchise.
Listen, Pam. I'm sorry, but we really don't have time to play with you today. So hurry on home, okay?
What's this? Were you so frightened by our power that you wet yourself, furry ears?
Did I what? You've got a lot of nerve, you one-eyed monster.
Nia, you do know one-eyed monster usually means...
Huh? Means what?
It's, Mithra, why are you blushing?
Shut up!
How the hell did they get away with that? Anyway, one example of this being a problem stateside is with a confession. Due to main character powers, the protagonist can end up with almost any playable character once the game ends. And the example at hand today is Bernadetta, who is your obligatory paranoid antisocial character who has a lot of familial trauma to get past, though the game does rightfully get flagged for playing up her reactions for laughs. Most of her conversations boil down to slowly prying herself out of her shell, with that being mentioned before the protagonist takes her to a place known for romantic getaways. In the original Japanese, she thinks they're about to do the deed, and that she's ready for it. But the English version said, nah, that's too explicit, so we're gonna regress her character by having her say this is just a secluded spot to murder her. Never mind all the conversations that were had before, we're back to square one because mommy will complain to Nintendo of America if we don't. It is admittedly one of, if not the most direct references to the act in this game, so I understand backing away if you weren't okay with an M rating, but was this drastic a character regression really your only recourse? And then there's the actual translation errors. Sadly, the 2 most blatant and most damaging are major spoilers, so I'll be dancing around them. But both severely damage a character's characterization, and one of them damages both characterization and agency. That one is a case where a character comes up with a feint to take a piece off the board, as it were. And towards the end of the scene, you have someone go, well, you played us good, which is in line with the rest of the discussion surrounding the event. Except in the English version, where a misinterpreted pronoun led the line to be the complete opposite, contradicting the wider context and perhaps suggesting that it wasn't as brilliant a plan as we thought, leaving the ending and the character who came up with the plan worse for wear. The other one has 2 characters talking to each other, but due to differing experience, they ended up with very different perspectives and found themselves talking across from each other. One mentions that he learned much about what people are capable of from the people in his life, while the other in response says something to the effect of, oh, so you can't fully understand where I'm coming from because I didn't have that growing up. Except in the English version, where the response was made to reference social status rather than social connections, a mistake which likely inflamed a lot of the discussion we see around the character who said it. And if you've played the game and want my opinion of that, Blue Lion's Best House. Go watch the video if you want any more info than that. Just with these few examples, I hope it's understood why localization has become such a battleground in the last few years. The fact that real-world shenanigans can encroach on it is enough to cause tension alone, but when you're also feeling compelled to change something just to maintain a certain reputation, you can end up compromising the work. And that's assuming you can even trust that what you're reading is accurate. And since the two mistakes I hinted at occur in plot-critical moments for a game that takes dozens of hours per run and multiple playthroughs to see everything, their presence is not going to inspire confidence. So if all of this bothers me so much, why wouldn't I just learn Japanese so I don't have to concern myself with this? Well, for one thing, I've been tempted to. The problem is that it's a major time commitment that a lot of people simply don't have the time to indulge. I have more time than most if I can afford to treat YouTube as an unpaid part-time job, but unless I were willing to make learning the language the part-time job instead, there simply isn't enough time in the day after seeing to necessities. And even then, the only reason I have to learn it right now is to note the differences for a media review on YouTube. So 3 guesses as to how devoted I would be to it in isolation. On top of that, I may be okay with subtitles for most foreign media, but for a video game, I always go with the English voices. The simple reason there is that not all of the background dialogue will get subtitles, and when I'm in the middle of gameplay, my focus should be on the game in front of me, not wondering what the characters are saying on the bottom fourth of my screen. Also, just because people say Japanese voice actors are better doesn't always make it true. I tried listening to the Japanese voices for 3 Houses a while back, and Bernadetta's was so piercingly high-pitched that I would sooner turn my cat's scratching post into a chalkboard. And no, I'm not playing you an example when that means I'd have to hear it a lot more than you would. I'm not that masochistic, damn it. Regardless, all of what we just discussed is contingent on whether we even agree that it's good to adapt the source material as closely as possible. For both adaptation and localization, you could give very compelling reasons for why something must change due to the particulars of a medium. For adaptation, if you're trying to translate a book to a visual medium, it can be difficult to represent someone's internal monologue or thought process during what's supposed to be an action scene. In fact, to blur the lines a little bit, my least favorite anime trope is the explain every action trope, or whatever people call it, where we have to pause the action every 10 seconds to explain the strategy that each side will use instead of just having it out already. However, one could argue that doing so is a matter of faithfully adapting the work, as a lot of anime get their start as light novels or manga, where a scene that takes seconds in real time could take minutes for us to read depending on how it's written or drawn. In cases like that, one could argue that you should change up how scenes are laid out to allow that exposition elsewhere, in order to ensure that when we see it come to fruition, that it'll be much more satisfying. It won't be a one-to-one adaptation, but so long as it's done well and maintains the spirit of the original, I suspect few people would have an issue with it. In terms of localization, we can bring up 2 examples when asking a simple question. What if the original is terrible? Yes, one of the examples is the obvious one, but let's get a less fun one out of the way first by going back to Fire Emblem. This time, we're going to Fire Emblem Engage, which at the time of recording is the latest entry in the franchise. The problems with the game's story go far beyond localization issues, but as with 3 Houses, the main character is once again important enough to where he can end up with basically anyone, though a lot more of his paired endings are platonic this time around. When the usual localization comparisons commenced, it was discovered that some of the platonic options were made so by the localization. In almost every case, it's an issue with the other person in question being under 18. While there may be some hemming and hawing for characters that are 16, given differences in age of consent laws and the mental maturity of the main character, the romantic endings that were made platonic also included an 11-year-old girl. No, I don't know what the original writers were thinking, and it's tragic that the conversation surrounding that was about the localization papering over it, rather than asking why intelligent systems took serious writing advice from a crack den. Though that's admittedly a question you could ask about the game's writing in general. I mean, if you want to argue the principle of leaving it in, don't let me stop you, but from a business and moral standpoint, I don't blame anyone for wanting to steer clear of that one. On a much less serious note, the one example that everyone brings up when talking about the original being worse is an anime called Ghost Stories. For the unfamiliar, it was released in Japan in the early 2000s, and due to it being allegedly unsuccessful there, the dub studio was given carte blanche to make of it what they wished. And given that this occurred in the early 2000s, a lot of the dialogue would get me a community guideline strike if I played it.
If I end up not being able to look in the mirror tonight, it's going to be your fault, Leo.
Are there any mirrors left in your house?
Huh? What do you mean?
You've lived there a while now. Haven't you shattered them? By looking at them?
Oh, I just love the charming little things that come out of that mouth of yours. Oh, look at that.
Stop
it! You're stretching my lips out!
Like this is the first time that's ever happened.
What's that supposed to mean?
Oh, you know what I'm referring to.
I don't think I like your insinuation!
Yeah, that's one of the tamer ones. I'm sure there's someone out there who likes the original run and was sad to see the official English dub become basically an abridged series, but let's be honest, the shock value alone makes it worth a watch. So yeah, there are absolutely times when it makes sense to change something. Broadly speaking though, when changes are made, there's an uphill battle that needs to be fought to justify them. And when arguments are given, they're seldom rooted in writing, but instead in business terms, with the standout being to quote, appeal to a wider audience. If you grew up playing video games in the mid-2000s to early 2010s, that shiver down your spine is a natural reaction to what was often a death sentence for your favorite franchise. In theory, appealing to a wider audience is done for exactly what it says, attracting a new audience to increase how successful your product is. The problem is that, in order to appeal to that wider audience, you often have to make sacrifices to the work that can alienate the original audience, which more often than not makes it less special. That then means the original audience is no longer giving you good word of mouth, and eventually no longer buying what you're selling, to where the fickle lowest common denominator you were appealing to won't have an anchor to keep them invested and up to date, and will just move on to the next hot topic, leaving you and your work in the waste bin of history. To demonstrate this, allow me to introduce you to a game called Supreme Commander. It is a real-time strategy game that was released in 2007, and is my favorite in the genre due to how unique it is. Part of what makes it unique is the economy, as while most games require you to pay the cost of a unit you're building up front, Supreme Commander allows you to queue them without necessarily having enough resources. As a result, input and output is often more important than resource count, and you can influence how fast certain build orders finish based on your income and the units assigned to work on them. This then simplifies unit creation enough to where another major change can be tossed in, a focus on macro scale with multiple tiers of units, with each tier's relative strength physically demonstrated through how big the unit is. A Tech 1 tank is going to look like an ant compared to a Tech 3 assault bot, and even that will pale in comparison to the experimental units that can be the size of a mountain and just as imposing. Both of these combine to create a stellar core gameplay loop, with there still being a dedicated community for multiplayer and a modded co-op mode to this day. However, the sequel is not nearly as well liked, because in trying to appeal to a wider audience, it ended up stripping away a lot of what made Supreme Commander unique. Both the unit tiers and the economy system were simplified to be more like the game's competitors, which meant the core audience ended up not liking the game, even as it made multiple improvements to unit pathing, performance, and mission variety. As such, the franchise is effectively dead outside of the niche fanbase for the original game, and future attempts to replicate or put a unique spin on that style of RTS have emerged under different names and from different companies. It may seem strange to bring this up, but while this is more often a concern with sequels, it's something that can negatively affect adaptations and localizations as well. For instance, a lot of high school anime and manga heavily feature the term senpai, which is an honorific that refers to an upperclassman or mentor. Given that it's sometimes used as a term of endearment, there isn't a good equivalent term in English that shares that context, which means when a localization tries to omit or replace the word, especially in cases where it's the only word used and not merely an honorific, there's often backlash. However, an argument could be made, especially before the term became more widely known outside of Japan, that replacing it is a matter of appealing to a wider audience, as there might be confusion to someone who hears it for the first time. As you would expect, there is often strong resistance to this due to what we discussed earlier, with the original fanbase liking the original media for said media, and not wishing to see it homogenized. As a more normie example, the Pokemon anime's English dub is infamous for labeling onigiri as either popcorn balls or jelly donuts depending on the episode. Never mind that the former isn't a thing I'm aware of, never mind that the color and texture are completely different from both, apparently dumb uncultured schwein like me would have had our world shattered if we were indirectly told that onigiri exists. You'd think they could at least say rice balls, as rice is less likely to be a foreign concept to an American nitwit, but clearly that wasn't good enough. Heaven forbid I hear about something that might lead me to be curious about somewhere other than where I live. Unfortunately, the conversation around this topic in particular has become much thornier due to taking on a social activist element. From a corporate standpoint, appealing to a wider audience hasn't stopped, they just tacked on a social activist bent and branded it as diversity, equity, and inclusion. There are undoubtedly people working in entertainment companies who believe in the stated social aims, but since most corporations are only interested in the financial aspect, we'll keep our focus there, especially since on those grounds, it's an alluring idea. Not only do you get the same theoretical draw of expanding your market, you also get a built-in defense for your work by just pointing at the critic and saying, "Be gone, bigot." Of course, as Disney has spent the last 5 years aptly demonstrating, the new tactics don't shame people into sticking around, it just means they won't tell you when they leave, meaning your only reliable metric for success becomes the cold, hard numbers. And remind me, how are those looking again? In fact, I'd argue that adding the social element has only hastened the decline, as it's made anyone looking for escapism flee more quickly than they would have otherwise. This isn't a politics channel, as should be evident by how much I've avoided saying what my opinion is when bringing up social and cultural issues, but one unavoidable topic in maintaining that distance is a staunch defense of escapism. There are a lot of important issues to address in the real world, but no one has infinite time or fortitude. Having common grounds where we can put our guns away and just unwind is something I see as vitally important to prevent us from becoming too cynical, stubborn, and uncharitable. It's not a problem if your work features politics or seeks to explore an idea, but it becomes a problem when one tries to inject an unambiguous message into a work where none existed previously, whether it be a sequel or an adaptation. At that point, you're not trying to entertain, you're trying to proselytize, often to an unreceptive audience. Fortunately for me, when one puts the message before the media, it almost always results in objective flaws, so I can by and large skewer a story on that basis rather than getting mired in the culture war. So on that note, back on topic. As we approach the end of this video, I think it's important to ensure that this discussion is put into proper perspective. With how often our current media is drawing from something that's already been done, it's important to think about what influence the original work can or should have on a project. On one hand, if the original work has a well-known flaw that you're able to fix, or an aspect of it may be difficult, if not impossible, to fit into a different language or medium, there may be grumblings, but so long as an honest effort is made to honor the original, most people will be okay with it change. However, there's a blurry line regarding whether a change is acceptable or not based on personal preference, with the investment in the original work, the quality of the new work, and the attitudes of the creator all having a sway on how well an adaptation or localization is received, both to a newcomer and to an old-timer. It can be a rather thorny issue, especially since the topic of acceptability is inherently subjective, but I hope that mulling over this has helped to ground the discussion into something easier to digest. Thus, to conclude this video, I'll give you one last example of these aspects playing off of each other for a game I reviewed this year. To be specific, it is the remaster of Advance Wars 1 and 2, with the originals releasing for the Game Boy Advance back in the early 2000s. I played the hell out of the originals, and still have them on the bookcase behind me to this day, so when I saw that they were remastering the two, I was really happy to see it. It took a while to release due to a pair of delays, but when it did, I was largely satisfied with it, save for a couple of script changes. One of them was pretty benign, as they had reworded a moment to include a reference to the "Are you winning, son" meme. On one hand, amusing and in character. On the other hand, please stop doing stuff like that. You're just gonna end up dating your game even more than those 3D models already have. However, the real one that bothered me is a moment near the end of the first game, where a character who is planning to expose the mastermind of the game's conflict ends up getting lured into a trap. In the original, the last line we see before entering gameplay was the character in trouble saying, "I'm sorry, father, I broke my promise." Depending on whether you unlocked missions related to her, this is in reference to her promising her father that if she ends up in any serious danger, that she would get out of Dodge. What made this moment a strong one was that the character is really capable, as when you're facing off against her father, she's constantly having to try and correct his mistakes, and when left to her own devices, she can give you a run for your money. This, combined with the callback, makes the next fight that much more intimidating, as it's an unknown quantity that can make mincemeat of you from a gameplay standpoint. However, in the remastered version, the line was changed to a defiant retort, which not only takes away the strong callback, but also weakens the intimidation factor of the enemy you're about to face, which naturally meant I was really upset when I saw it, with that moment being where I started thinking about making this video. The reason I bring this up isn't to shame the game, at least not entirely, but instead instead to offer perspective. Advance Wars as a franchise is one that's intentionally simple from a story standpoint, with characters who are pretty straightforward and circumstances that sometimes exist as little more than a reason for gameplay. In that context, was a script change, even a critical change like this one, the most important element to focus on when, on the whole, the game is a very faithful recreation of the original games, especially where it matters the most, with the gameplay. Because of that, rather than making a big deal out of it in the moment, I chose to mention it while giving even less detail than I did here, instead choosing to focus on more important flaws like the jarring contrast between the 2D animation and 3D models, as well as the inability to save in the versus mode, something even the original GBA games figured out. In short, while I would have raised hell if something of this magnitude happened in Fire Emblem, Advance Wars being more focused on gameplay has more room in my mind to screw up in this regard, even if I'm still not happy about it. And with that, we come to the end of this video. With how subjective this topic can be, there isn't necessarily a need for a definitive statement apart from saying write well and mind the context, so I feel that exploring the arguments and circumstances is sufficient for this video. With that said, thank you all for stopping by, and let me know what you think in the comments below. I've experimented with videos like this before, but it's a rare occurrence when one of them gets a finished script. As while it's easy to come up with ideas, ensuring that there's enough meat on the bones is the tricky part, so hopefully it worked out as such this time. As for what I'll be up to next year, I released a channel update yesterday going over how things have been going and what you can expect in the future. Until that comes to fruition, thank you all once again for watching, and I'll see you next year for whatever awaits.